Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Strangers in Jerusalem YouTube channel. Thank you for the support. Before we get to the clip, please subscribe and like the video, and also check out my book. You can get it on Amazon. It's called A Stranger in Jerusalem, Seeing Jesus as a Jew. What we see in the literature is that by the time Jesus began his ministry, Messianic expectations had reached a fever pitch. And so here's a few examples of this. After Herod died in 4 BC, the regions of Judea and Galilee experienced an increase in Messianic personalities. These are different people who had Messianic or kingly aspirations. Prior to Herod's death, hope of a conquering Messiah seemed to be kind of a distant hope. But in the first century, the realization of the Messiah seemed imminent for much of the populace, especially in response to the Roman authoritarian and militaristic governing style. Josephus, what we see in Josephus is that there's many people. He details at least a dozen figures in the first century alone who acted in ways that caused portions of the populace to view them as possible messiahs or messianic candidates. And Josephus explained that many of these figures were declared king by their followers and were seen as nuisances to Roman authorities. You got to remember that only the Roman Senate could make someone king. For example, they made Herod the Great a vassal king of the Judean frontier. Anyone who designated themselves or whose followers designated them as kings would have been considered treasonous and subject to severe punishment. Consequently, Jewish temple bureaucrats and the Roman officials attempted to quash any movement led by a king in their land, especially anyone who sought to wrest control of the region away from the Romans and the temple establishment. So you're toast if you try to even get near any of those objectives. So here, let me give you a few examples. One such figure was Judas from Sepphoris. This is a town in Galilee 5 miles from Nazareth. So in the wake of Herod's death, Judas gathered a sizable following and besieged several royal armories in 4 BC. He subsequently targeted other people who had royal aspirations, probably because he himself had his eye on the throne. And what happened after this is that the Roman general Varus in 4 BC swept in, captured a lot of these rebels, including people who followed Judas, and Varus lined the 20-mile road from Sepphoris to the Sea of Galilee with 2,000 crucified Jewish rebels. 2,000 rebels. And since Nazareth was only 3 miles from Sepphoris, it is likely that Jesus heard about this event from his parents and peers as he grew older and was taught about Rome and their role in society. Jesus also would have walked this road to the Sea of Galilee, and he would have probably had these messianic or rebel crucifixions in mind. That same year in 4 BC, there's a guy named Simon of Perea. He put a crown on his head and declared himself king. And with some followers, people who thought he was the Messiah, he proceeded to burn several royal armories or properties, including the palace at Jericho. And what happened to him? Roman soldiers eventually intercepted and beheaded him. A few years later, in 2 BC, there's a certain guy who declared himself king and a shepherd. So he uses the shepherd imagery, he declared himself king and went about killing Roman soldiers and Jewish royalists until Roman authorities captured him and then killed him. But what's key here is that his identification as a shepherd and a king was an overt statement about his messianic aspirations. So then we move a few decades later, we get John the Baptist. John the Baptist, if you remember, established such a large following that he was imprisoned and eventually beheaded after challenging Herod Antipas. Josephus recorded that Herod was particularly concerned that John's power and influence with the populace would lead to rebellion. Neither Josephus nor the New Testament indicates that John was viewed as a Messiah, but I include him in this list because some people likely saw him as a messianic candidate due to his ability to garner support from the messianic-minded populace. About 10 years after John the Baptist's death, another figure gained a large following among the Samaritans this is 35 AD. These Samaritans are people closely associated with Jews, both ideologically and geographically. Samaritans awaited a figure like Moses who would restore the ancient temple. This Samaritan prophet, we don't know his name, but this prophet promised to show his followers the holy vessels that Moses supposedly buried on their holy mountain, Mount Gerizim. What happened to him? Well, Pontius Pilate and his infantry attacked the group, killing some and arresting others. A decade later, in the mid-40s, a guy named Theudas, a prophet who was known for performing miracles, led a group to the Jordan River. And what he promised is that when they arrive at the river, he would divide the waters as had Joshua. When you promise to do something like Joshua, that speaks of military conquest, right? Because that's what Joshua did. Before the group even arrived at the Jordan River, Roman authorities attacked them, beheading Theudas and killing many of his followers. So that's important to note. At this time, Judas from Gamala in Galilee gathered a group and revolted against Rome in order to establish national independence. The group eventually failed. And what Josephus gives us the information. We read about this in Acts 5:37, but also Josephus, he doesn't tell us about Judas's fate, but we learn that two of his sons were crucified in 46 to 48 in consequence of this rebellion. Judas's third son, Menachem, also had similar kingly aspirations. There's another guy, an Egyptian prophet, who came to the Mount of Olives and promised all of his followers that he would lead them down to the city, and on his command that the city would become theirs and the walls would fall down just like Joshua. And Roman authorities swept in, rushed to the temple, to the Mount of Olives, and arrested over 600 people. And this guy, this unnamed prophet, escaped, fled, and nobody heard of him. I'll tell you about another individual here is Jesus, another guy named Jesus. In the 60s, this guy named Jesus ben Ananias came to the Temple Mount during the Feast of Tabernacles in Sukkot, and he proclaimed judgment upon Jerusalem. But what's interesting about this guy is that he shouts out quotations from Jeremiah 7, precisely the same block of scripture that Jesus of Nazareth used when he accused priests of turning the temple into a den of robbers. There's that language in Jeremiah 7. So as they did with Jesus of Nazareth, the Roman authorities arrested this other Jesus and whipped him. And Josephus says that they whipped him so much that his flesh gave way, exposing his bones. And then there's a few other figures in the 60s, Menachem, another guy named John, and then there's another individual, Simon. And all these people they came into Jerusalem, took over the Roman barracks, put on royal robes and tried to be the king. And all of them were captured and beheaded and taken to Rome and executed. And a lot of their followers as well. So what we gather a few observations from these texts, what they tell us is that from these 12 cases, this gives us a context for the ministry of Jesus and his ultimate demise. So first, Galilee, a lot of these people were from Galilee, and Galilee seemed to be a hotbed for Messianic fervor in the first century. The majority of these figures come either from Galilee or close by. And even to this day, there's monuments and tombs of prominent rabbis and Jewish holy men in antiquity that pepper the landscape of the immediate vicinity of the Sea of Galilee. Another observation from all of these accounts of these Messianic type figures is the level of volatility between the Jewish populace and the authorities of Jerusalem, both Jewish and Roman. These Messiah figures seem to gain support from sizable segments within the Jewish populace and were met with swift punishment by Roman soldiers.